Grace Kelly stepped into Monaco wearing jewels that looked like symbols of romance, but behind their diamonds was a fortune almost impossible to comprehend. Some pieces were allegedly valuable enough to rival private aircraft, and the most extraordinary among them carried stories the palace would have preferred to remain locked away forever. Whenever Grace appeared before the public, the effect was almost overwhelming. Her gowns were immaculate, her posture controlled, her expression serene, and around her neck could hang enough diamonds to represent a level of wealth most people would never encounter in an entire lifetime. Photographers called her name from every direction, hungry for the perfect image, while palace security remained close enough to remind everyone that this was no ordinary celebrity appearance. The jewels were beautiful, certainly, but beauty was only the surface. Behind every stone was money, history, status, and something far more dangerous: ownership. Grace's collection was not simply a glamorous extension of her wardrobe. It represented a portable concentration of royal wealth. Diamonds, emeralds, precious metals, rare craftsmanship, each piece carried a value that could already reach staggering heights before Grace's name was even attached to it. Once her story became part of that object, the calculation changed completely. A modern luxury private plane can cost millions, yet combinations of the stones Grace wore publicly for a single evening could theoretically rival, or even surpass, that price. And unlike an aircraft, which ages, depreciates, and eventually becomes obsolete, a jewel touched by royalty can become more desirable with every passing decade. That is because royal jewelry has two prices. The first is measurable: carat weight, clarity, cut, rarity, craftsmanship. The second is almost impossible to calculate: provenance. Who owned it? Who wore it? What marriage it represented? What dynasty it belonged to? What private moment became attached to it? With Grace, those layers multiplied. She was not merely a princess. She had already been Hollywood royalty before Monaco gave her an actual title, meaning every jewel connected two powerful myths at once. But there was a complication hidden beneath all that brilliance. Some jewels were unquestionably Grace's. Others occupied a far murkier world of princely gifts, family treasures, ceremonial possessions, and inheritance traditions understood inside palace walls but rarely explained beyond them. Grace could wear extraordinary wealth before millions of people while still facing questions an ordinary owner never would. Could she sell it? Alter it? Give it away? Decide who received it after her death? In Monaco, possession and freedom were not always the same thing. That contradiction followed her throughout her royal life. Hollywood had taught Grace how to command attention. Monaco taught her that the objects drawing that attention could also carry obligations. Every necklace could represent duty. Every bracelet could preserve a family memory. Every diamond could quietly remind her that she had entered a system older and more complicated than fame. And among all those treasures, one jewel would rise above the others. Its importance would not come only from its enormous value, but from what it represented. The moment Prince Rainier turned a private promise into a declaration powerful enough for the entire world to notice. Years later, after Grace was gone, photographs of that jewel remained everywhere, but the full fate of her greatest treasures became far more difficult to follow, opening questions the palace could never completely silence. And to understand why one woman could possess a jewelry collection capable of competing with the price of an aircraft, we have to return to the moment when Rainier decided Grace Kelly's first engagement ring simply wasn't extraordinary enough. The first ring should have ended the story. Instead, it allegedly began a quiet royal escalation. Rainier had already given Grace a symbol of commitment, but once Monaco's future princess entered the glare of Hollywood publicity, another diamond appeared, dramatically larger, more valuable, and impossible for the world to ignore. Their romance had always been more than a love story. It was a collision between two worlds that understood image in completely different ways. Grace Kelly was already known internationally, admired as one of Hollywood's most elegant and controlled stars. Rainier ruled a small principality whose influence depended heavily on prestige, tradition, and the ability to command attention far beyond Monaco's borders. Their engagement brought those two forces together, and almost immediately, private affection became public symbolism. The first ring was refined rather than overwhelming, connected to Monaco's colors and suited to the intimacy of a personal promise. It carried meaning without demanding spectacle. But Grace's life was never going to remain private. The moment her engagement became international news, every photograph became part romance, part royal publicity. Her hand would be studied, her clothing would be discussed, and the ring itself would become a statement about the prince she was marrying and the monarchy she was about to represent. Then came the diamond that changed everything. Rainier's decision to present Grace with a spectacular emerald cut stone felt like more than extravagance. It was a declaration. Grace was not simply leaving Hollywood, she was stepping into a royal identity, and the jewel on her finger needed to announce that transformation with absolute authority. The diamond's severe geometry, icy clarity, flanking stones, and immense presence gave it a kind of controlled power. It was not delicate. It was impossible to ignore. For Grace, that brilliance carried two meanings at once. It represented devotion, but it also hinted at the expectations closing around her. The larger the symbol became, the larger the role became with it. Her gestures, her wardrobe, her public appearances, even the way she carried herself would now be judged through the lens of monarchy. The ring did not simply celebrate her future. It marked the beginning of a life in which nearly everything personal could become political. Its value only deepened with time. A conventional appraisal could measure the diamond itself, but Grace Kelly's name transformed the equation. At auction, collectors would not merely compete for carats or craftsmanship. They would be bidding for the physical object connected to one of the most famous transformations of the 20th century, the moment an actress became a princess. And that was where the romance began to give way to something more complicated. Because not every magnificent jewel surrounding Grace came from a simple exchange between husband and wife. Some pieces had existed before her. Some carried older loyalties, older claims, and rules she had never written. The engagement diamond proved Rainier could place staggering wealth on Grace's hand, but inside Monaco's vaults waited jewels whose real power came not from romance, but from generations of royal ownership. Behind Monaco's glittering receptions was another world entirely. Locked cases, guarded inventories, private ledgers, and jewels that could appear on a princess one night and vanish for years afterward. Grace had entered Europe's royal class, but access to its treasures came with rules more complicated than any Hollywood contract. Beyond the public ceremonies, the jewelry existed inside a far more controlled system. Heavy doors separated spectacle from possession. Velvet-lined cases held pieces that were not simply chosen on impulse, and private inventories reduced priceless objects to catalog numbers, descriptions, and carefully guarded records. Before major occasions, jewelers could be summoned discreetly, clasps checked, stones inspected, settings secured. Nothing about these treasures was casual. Every appearance carried calculation. That was one of the first realities Grace had to understand. Wearing a royal jewel did not always mean owning it in the ordinary sense. A necklace could rest around her throat for an evening and still remain tied to a family collection. A tiara might be available for ceremonial use, but impossible to sell. A brook could be presented as though it belonged naturally to the woman wearing it, yet its future might already be governed by traditions she had never been asked to approve. And in a royal household, those distinctions mattered. Jewels could communicate what words could not. A tiara at a state dinner suggested continuity. A historic necklace could honor a diplomatic relationship. A brook associated with a particular branch of the family could quietly signal loyalty, memory, or rank. To outsiders, these pieces looked decorative. Inside palace life, they could carry the weight of protocol. Grace had come from Hollywood, where diamonds could be costumes, studio loans, publicity tools, or personal purchases. Monaco offered something entirely different. Here, jewels carried ancestors. They carried expectation. Some could be worn freely. Others required the right occasion, the right status, even the right interpretation, and a few seemed almost untouchable. The palace staff understood that hierarchy better than anyone. They knew which pieces belonged personally to Grace, which were tied to the princely family, which stones had been reset over time, and which objects were never casually discussed beyond the household. Their silence protected more than security. It protected the boundaries between private ownership and dynastic power. That silence also created mystery. Some pieces appeared only rarely. Others were never photographed clearly enough to identify with certainty. The result was irresistible speculation that the jewels known to the public represented only part of the wealth surrounding Grace, and the less that was confirmed, the more powerful the legend became. Then there was an even more dangerous category: the jewel that could not be worn innocently, not cursed, not forbidden by superstition, forbidden by meaning. The wrong woman wearing the wrong piece could suggest succession, favoritism, ownership, even authority. A necklace could become a declaration before anyone spoke a word, and one particular necklace would come to represent something even greater, because its worth would no longer rest only in diamonds, but in the transformation of Grace herself. Among all those locked cases, one category of jewels mattered more than the others: the pieces chosen to transform Grace Kelly from an American actress into the unmistakable visual embodiment of Princess Grace. A diamond necklace can decorate a woman. The right royal necklace can redefine her. When Grace appeared beneath Monaco's chandeliers wearing stones reserved for extraordinary occasions, observers saw perfection. But behind that perfection was a woman discovering that every jewel added to her image also tightened the expectations surrounding her. By then, the transformation was no longer subtle. Grace Kelly, the actress, had not simply married into royalty, she had been carefully reshaped into Princess Grace, and jewelry became one of the most powerful tools in that transformation. The gowns were chosen with precision. The diamonds at her throat were balanced against earrings selected to match. Every detail reinforced the same message: this was no longer a Hollywood star visiting a palace. This was Monaco presenting its princess to the world. And necklaces carried a special kind of authority. Their value was not determined by one stone alone, but by the difficulty of assembling many exceptional diamonds into a single harmonious piece. Matching size, clarity, brilliance, and craftsmanship could take years. Add royal provenance, historical association, and Grace's own fame, and the numbers could become staggering. In a competitive modern auction, one extraordinary ensemble tied directly to her could theoretically rise beyond the price of a smaller private aircraft. But the money was only part of the story. Once Grace wore a jewel, she became part of its history. The necklace no longer belonged only to a jeweler, a family inventory, or a princely collection. It became linked to her transformation. Collectors would not simply see diamonds, they would see the woman who left Hollywood and entered a dynasty. That association could turn precious stones into cultural relics. Yet the greater the admiration became, the tighter the expectations seemed to grow. The public wanted Grace flawless. The palace needed her composed. Certain jewels became connected to certain occasions, and certain formal appearances demanded the correct symbols of rank. What looked effortless from the outside could carry quiet rules underneath. A different necklace, an unexpected brooch, even a missing ceremonial piece could invite questions about status, loyalty, or protocol. Hollywood had taught Grace that costume could be temporary. A wardrobe belonged to a role, and when the role ended, the clothes disappeared with it. Royal jewelry was different. These pieces could outlive everyone who touched them. A necklace might remain within one family for generations, carrying memories long after the person most associated with it was gone. That permanence created a more intimate burden. After a grand reception, the diamonds could be removed, the weight lifted from her neck, and the silence that followed could feel almost startling. Without the ceremony, without the formal expectations, Grace was still a woman confronting the difference between being admired and being free. The jewels made her look untouchable. They also reminded her how much of her new identity belonged to something larger than herself. And as those treasures became more closely tied to her name, another question quietly moved closer. If some pieces were personal, while others belonged to the dynasty, who would decide where they went after her? Who would inherit the memories, the wealth, and the symbolism? And would Grace herself truly have the final say? Because every time Grace fastened a royal necklace, another question quietly grew more important. When the photographs ended, and her lifetime eventually did too, who would actually own what she had worn? Royal families rarely fight over jewelry only because of money. They fight because a necklace can mean love, rank, legitimacy, memory, or rejection. Behind Grace's collection lay a question capable of dividing any dynasty: which treasures were hers to pass down, and which belonged to Monaco regardless of her wishes. By this point, the jewels surrounding Grace no longer belonged to one simple category. Some were personal possessions, pieces she could regard as truly her own. Others had been given within marriage, carrying the emotional weight of Rainier's affection, but also the expectations of royal life. Then there were the treasures tied to the princely institution itself, objects whose importance reached beyond any single person. That distinction may sound technical, but inside a family it could become deeply personal. Because inheritance is never only about value. A necklace worn at a wedding can become a memory. A bracelet given after a private milestone can become a symbol of affection. A brooch associated with one child may carry more emotional weight than a diamond worth 10 times as much. And once those objects are connected to a mother as famous as Grace, every decision about them becomes loaded with meaning. For Caroline, Stephanie, and Albert, the inheritance of Grace's world was never simply financial. Each of them inherited a different relationship to her image, her memory, and the expectations attached to the Grimaldi name. A jewel passed to one child could be seen as sentimental. Passed to another, it could be interpreted as symbolic. And if a piece remained with the palace instead of the family, that decision could speak just as loudly. It is easy to imagine Grace privately associating certain treasures with certain children. A daughter might be linked in her mind to one necklace, another piece might carry a memory too personal to reduce to an inventory number. But sentiment does not always control dynastic property. Formal ownership, palace custom, and institutional rules could complicate even the most intimate intentions. That is where the real tension begins. The jewel with the highest theoretical auction value might not be the one a daughter would fight hardest to keep. The most important piece might instead be the one Grace wore during a family celebration, or the one connected to a private bond that no outsider could ever fully understand. And outsiders were left with fragments. Inventories may have existed. Family understandings may have been clear behind closed doors, but palace discretion meant the public could rarely reconstruct every decision. That silence only made the questions louder. The idea of selling one of Grace's most historic jewels made the issue even more explosive. The financial return could be enormous, but the backlash could be greater still. A sale would not look like ordinary asset management. It could be seen as selling memory, heritage, even a piece of Monaco itself. That is why some royal jewels effectively become priceless. Not because no number can be imagined, but because putting them on the market would create consequences far beyond money. And then came the strangest part of all. Several pieces seemed to grow more mysterious with time, not because they were displayed more often, but because they were seen less and less. Were they preserved, divided, reset, passed privately from one generation to another, or intentionally kept away from public attention? And that is where the story stops being about inheritance documents and becomes something far more tantalizing. Because after Grace was gone, some of the jewels the world expected to keep seeing seemed to retreat behind palace walls. The strangest thing about a legendary royal jewel isn't seeing it under lights. It's realizing you haven't seen it for decades. After Grace's death, photographs remained everywhere, but certain pieces became elusive, and every absence invited the same irresistible question. Where did Monaco's most valuable treasures actually go? Grace remained frozen in memory, forever connected to the diamonds, necklaces, bracelets, and brooches that helped define her royal image. But the jewels themselves were different. They could be locked away, passed privately, altered, protected, even dismantled. And once a piece disappeared from regular public view, certainty disappeared with it. That was when speculation began. There were innocent explanations, of course. Royal jewelry is not worn like ordinary jewelry. Some pieces may be too fragile for frequent use. Others may be reserved for family occasions, placed into secure storage, or passed quietly through inheritance. A necklace can be redesigned. A bracelet can be broken apart. Individual stones can be reset into something entirely new. But when a palace says little, even reasonable explanations begin to feel mysterious. That silence turned royal watchers into detectives. Old photographs were studied carefully. Clasps were compared. Diamond shapes were examined. A familiar stone appearing years later in another setting could trigger an entirely new theory. Was this the same jewel Grace once wore? Had part of a necklace survived inside a newer piece? Had a historic brooch been dismantled so discreetly that the public never realized it was gone? And then there were pieces that seemed simply to stop appearing. A recognizable necklace might vanish from major occasions. A bracelet once closely associated with Grace could become almost impossible to trace. A brooch might exist forever in photographs, but nowhere else the public could confirm. That absence created a strange kind of power. The less people knew, the more valuable the mystery became. The palace had reasons to protect that uncertainty. Confirming a jewel's exact value could create security concerns. Confirming who inherited it could reopen sensitive family questions. Confirming that a piece had been sold might provoke accusations that part of Monaco's heritage had quietly disappeared into private hands. Sometimes ambiguity was safer than explanation. But outside the palace, the commercial stakes were enormous. If a verified Grace Kelly jewel ever reached a major auction, collectors would not be bidding only for diamonds. Museums, luxury houses, private buyers, royal enthusiasts, and billionaires could be competing for something far rarer: physical ownership of Grace's legend. That possibility makes the collection almost impossible to value. A jeweler can price stones. An auction house can estimate provenance. But no one can know what happens when extraordinary wealth collides with nostalgia, celebrity, monarchy, and scarcity until the hammer actually falls. And that may be precisely why the most important pieces remain beyond the market. Once sold, their value becomes public. As long as they stay hidden, their worth remains limitless in the imagination. Yet hiding a jewel protects more than its price. In a monarchy, some pieces carry messages powerful enough that simply choosing who wears them next can ignite speculation about status, loyalty, and succession. There was one rule no palace needed to write down. Some jewels could never be worn innocently. Put the wrong piece on the wrong woman at the wrong event, and diamonds stopped being decoration. They became a declaration about inheritance, authority, memory, and who had permission to step into Grace's shadow. That was the danger hidden inside the most recognizable pieces connected to Grace. The more closely a jewel became tied to her identity, the harder it became for anyone else to wear it without inviting comparison. A necklace could suddenly feel like a title. A brooch could suggest continuity. A diamond once associated with Grace could carry more symbolic force than an official statement, because the public did not need to understand palace inventories to understand what it was seeing. That is what made these objects so powerful. Royal jewelry speaks without explaining itself. For the younger generation, that power created a difficult choice. Revive Grace's jewels and risk being measured against her. Leave them untouched and allow them to become almost sacred relics. Neither option was simple. Every appearance could reopen old memories, revive questions about inheritance, and force the family to confront the impossible standard Grace left behind. For Caroline, the burden would be especially heavy. Wearing one of her mother's most famous pieces could be interpreted as an act of love, but it could also be read as succession, as though she were stepping into Grace's symbolic position. The same jewel that carried tenderness inside the family could trigger speculation outside it. Stephanie would create a different reaction entirely. Her more rebellious identity meant that the same necklace or brooch could suddenly feel transformed, even confrontational. What looked like continuity on one daughter might look like defiance on the other. That is the strange power of royal objects. Their meaning changes depending on who wears them. And then there was Albert. As sovereign, his role placed him at the center of a much larger question. These jewels were not only family possessions, they were pieces of Monaco's dynastic image. Any decision about displaying, lending, transferring, or preserving them could carry consequences beyond sentiment. That is how a jewel becomes too powerful to wear. Not because it is cursed, not because anyone fears the stone itself, but because its connection to Grace is so overwhelming that the person wearing it risks disappearing beneath the memory attached to it. And here the private plane comparison becomes even more striking. A machine worth millions ages. It requires maintenance. Eventually, it becomes obsolete. A Grace Kelly diamond can do the opposite. Decades of silence, rarity, and restricted access can make it more desirable, more mysterious, and potentially more valuable. Which raises the most provocative possibility of all. Perhaps the greatest treasure in Grace's collection is not the piece displayed most often, but the one Monaco refuses to sell, refuses to explain, and perhaps barely allows anyone to wear. And that changes the entire question. The mystery is no longer which jewel costs more than a private plane. It is what happens when a jewel becomes so valuable, emotionally and politically, that assigning it a price almost becomes impossible. Imagine the auction room. Billionaires waiting. Collectors whispering. Cameras fixed on one illuminated case. Then, Grace Kelly's most legendary jewel appears. The bidding passes the price of a mansion, then a yacht, then a private aircraft. But the real shock is that Monaco would lose something money could never purchase back. If one of Grace's greatest jewels ever reached the open market, the sale would become more than an auction. It would become a global event. Authentication would be complete. The provenance would be unquestioned. Major houses would compete for the right to offer it, knowing that the object carried something no ordinary gemstone could reproduce. Buyers would not simply be purchasing diamonds. They would be buying rarity, monarchy, Hollywood, romance, tragedy, and one of the most recognizable transformations of the 20th century. That is why the bidding could become almost irrational. The engagement ring stands at the center of that emotional equation. Its story begins before Grace officially became a princess, before palace duty fully replaced movie stardom, before her identity became permanently tied to Monaco. It was more than a symbol of marriage. It marked the crossing point between Grace Kelly and Princess Grace. That connection would make any theoretical valuation feel incomplete, because the jewel's worth would depend on how desperately someone wanted to own a piece of that transformation. But selling it would create another kind of price. A figure measured in millions might satisfy an auction house, yet the symbolic cost to Monaco could be far greater. Once sold, a dynastic memory would become private property. The jewel could leave the principality, disappear into a vault, and belong to whoever had written the largest check. Palace advisors would have to consider legacy. Family members would be forced to confront memories attached to the piece, and Monaco itself could face the uncomfortable question of why something so closely tied to Grace had been allowed to leave. That is the deeper truth running through every part of this story. Grace made the jewels more valuable because the world eventually stopped seeing them separately from her. Rainier's gifts, the palace rules, ceremonial necklaces, disputed questions of inheritance, pieces that vanished from view, and jewels considered almost too meaningful to wear all became part of the same mythology. And suddenly, the comparison with a private aircraft becomes more than a measure of money. An aircraft represents freedom, movement, the ability to leave. Grace's most important jewels represented almost the opposite. They symbolized permanence, duty, memory, and the weight of belonging to something larger than herself. The more valuable they became, the more tightly they seemed connected to the life she could never simply step away from. Perhaps that is why the greatest display of wealth is not selling such a treasure for tens of millions. It is keeping it beyond reach. Keeping the case closed. Letting the world speculate. Refusing to reduce memory, power, and legacy to a hammer price. Because long after the flashbulbs stopped and the palace doors closed, Grace Kelly's diamonds continued doing what royal jewels have always done best: keeping their secrets, guarding a dynasty's memories, and leaving the outside world wondering what else may still be locked away.